Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone joining us today, wherever you may be in the world. Welcome to Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis webinar series, third Plenum Reboot, China's new economic policy playbook. This is our first session, and we're here to dig into the nuts and bolts of China's EV industry, a space that really showcases China's push for tech self-reliance and industrial growth. The insights we're about to discuss here is not just about understanding China's game plan, but also about seeing how this might ripple across the globe. But before we dive in, let me just quickly introduce our fantastic panel today. We have Kyle Chan, a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton and an adjunct researcher at the Rand Corporation. We have AJ Cortese, a senior research associate at MacroPolo and a fellow at UPenn's Project on Future of U.S. China Relations. We have Arthur Kroeber, founding partner of Gavekal Dragonomics and an adjunct professor at NYU Stern School of Business. He's also the author of China's Economy, What Everyone Needs to Know, a must read if you're trying to understand the broader picture of China's economic trajectory. And last but certainly not the least, we have Ivy Yang, founder of Wavelet Strategy and a regular voice in the Financial Times Chinese edition. Ivy has really got a sharp eye for cross-cultural communication reputation management. Finally, I'm Lizzi C, a fellow on Chinese economy at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and really excited to be moderating today's session. We've got a lot to chat about, so just jump right in. I want to kick things off by talking about what has made China's EV industry kick. Arthur, from where you are sitting, what do you think are the big reasons behind China's success in the EV space, and how much of that success can we chalk up to their industrial policy?
Well, it's certainly policy driven. I think the first observation is that China made a strategic decision almost 20 years ago that they were going to prioritize the development of not only electric vehicles, but green energy technology generally. I think this is partly motivated by environmental concerns, but really more motivated by two other concerns. Number one was they perceived an opportunity for Chinese manufacturers to get in on the ground floor of big new technologies that were going to be a major part of the 21st century economy. They'd been very frustrated by their lack of success in conventional vehicles. The power of the incumbents was very strong. And so moving into electric vehicles and all of the associated green technologies, solar, wind, batteries, et cetera, was an opportunity for Chinese companies really to gain kind of a first mover advantage. So there's a big strategic push around those industries generally. And then they had a very comprehensive suite of policies, which were both on the supply side and the demand side. So they had all kinds of subsidies and supports for green energy manufacturers, but they also created an ecosystem of demand and an increasingly mature market, domestic market for green technologies, including electric vehicles. So I think when we talk about industrial policy per se, I think what we normally have in our minds is a set of policies designed to directly support the producers of a certain kind of good. And China had those, but the reason I think that they've been so successful is that they had a very wide range of policies which were designed to create a thriving market for all of these technologies, interconnections between the different green technologies, and integrated supply chains. So it was a comprehensive set of policies, some of which I think you could describe as industrial policy, and some of which, frankly, I think would just be considered sort of economic strategy more generally.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And Kyle, just jump off what Arthur just said. How do you think that China managed to shift gears from their traditional auto industry to really focus on EV? And were there any specific strategies or policies that stood out to you in making all this happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the funny thing is, like, if you look at the traditional auto industry, That was often seen as sort of an industrial policy failure in China. And a lot of people I talk to in the industry and researchers in China have different theories for why. But the sort of short story there is you have an effort to try to partner, have these joint ventures with foreign automakers, and to try to produce at least for the domestic market. But then it sort of stopped there, and then you had these the incumbent sort of state-owned automakers within China, pretty comfortable with a very large domestic market. But there weren't that many sort of Chinese brands that broke out into the mainstream internationally. And so, yeah, the joke I always, throw out there is, how many, if you weren't following the Chinese automotive industry, and if you're not in China, if you're in the U.S., how many Chinese car companies could you name before the rise of BYD in the EV industry recently? Then there was a whole bunch of different policies and measures and efforts, both at the central level and especially at the local government level, that I would just sort of highlight. One example is, the efforts to actually reduce traffic congestion and pollution, air pollution on the streets of Beijing and later Shanghai and other cities. And so while that was supposed to be sort of a multi-pronged strategy, targeting environmental issues, public health issues, just traffic, which is an everything issue. It also helped, obviously. In fact, it was almost sort of like a brilliant coincidence that it boosted demand in exactly the places where you would want to start driving EV adoption, the large cities, wealthier urban middle class car buyers. So that's one example. You have local government support by the Shenzhen municipal government, for example, building up, say, an electric public bus fleet long before the EV passenger vehicles really took off. So you have this whole range, and then later on, we can get into Shanghai and Liqiang and Tesla and that sort of turbocharging everything. But you have in some cases a broader sort of national effort, but in many cases sort of this local champion approach.
Fantastic. And there's also another sort of key ingredient of China's secret recipe that I frequently hear in the media, which is whole supply chain support. AJ, you have a fantastic report with your colleagues at MacroPolo studying China's supply chain. So how do you see supply chain or vertical integration specifically, especially with BYD's strategy of keeping key components in-house? How does that shape the success of China's EV industry? And what's your take on how this has influenced the broader market?
Absolutely. So I think within the broader context that Arthur and Kyle really did a good job laying out, I think we also have to sort of examine the competitive strategies that the actual automakers and companies that make up the supply chain undertook to get where they are today. So the vertical integration strategy is not uniquely Chinese. I think we've seen Tesla pursue this to a great degree as well. And that's partially because the nature of the electric vehicle supply chain is a simpler version compared to traditional automotive. So you don't have the same existing suite of tier one suppliers, the same complicated components. And so it actually makes it easier to bring a lot of these components in-house. So what are the real benefits to vertical integration? Sort of at the macro level, it's cost leadership, right? Chinese EV companies have been able to bring the costs down on lots of different models. But it goes beyond really cost, because what the vertical integration gives you, especially if you're a company like BYD, which has been able to vertically integrate practically everything, but most importantly was the battery, the costliest component of the car. And so that really gave them a huge leg up in terms of what they can do on price and how competitive they can be. But it also allows them to more rapidly and effectively integrate its in-house R&D across its manufacturing process, because it controls sort of the upstream inputs, the manufacturing process, and then of course markets these downstream vehicles. And so this tighter control allows you to develop your product roadmap in a more nimble way. Chinese hardware firms have always been furiously iterative in terms of churning out new products and sort of responding and refining those offerings to consumer feedback and data. So I think vertical integration has played a crucial role, but I think that the environment to vertically integrate was significantly easier than it was in traditional automotives, and for Chinese companies to move quickly and scale these components in-house. So I think when we look at the case of BYD, beyond the battery, their entire power electronic system is done in-house, from the battery management system to its silicon carbide control module. These are all, fairly new supply chains in the EV space. And so I think it's really allowed them to sort of capitalize on that first mover advantage and bring that into cost advantages in the competitive market.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, panelists, for all your insights on the success of China's EV industry. I wanted to pivot to some of the challenges, both at home and abroad, for China's EV industry. Arthur, coming back to you, given the pressures Chinese EV makers are facing, like excess capacity at home and trade tensions abroad, how do you think they're going to navigate those hurdles? And what does this mean for global automakers who are trying to either hold their ground in China or protect their markets back home?
I think you can divide that into a few different buckets. So first of all, if we take excess capacity, I actually don't think that that's a particularly important issue for the EV industry. If you look, there's a lot of excess capacity in the Chinese auto industry, but most of this is concentrated in the conventional vehicle segment. And if you just think about what the likely adoption pattern is over the coming decade or more for electric vehicles, I think it's likely that China is going to have to expand its capacity quite a bit to meet the demand. So cyclically, you may have a little bit of a problem, but I don't really think that that's a structural issue. You do seem to have a kind of a pause domestically in terms of consumer adoption of EVs, things like range anxiety, which are a big obstacle to adoption of EVs in other markets, are not absent from China. So they have, I think some adjustments that need to be made in the short term. But broadly speaking, you have a lot of policy support for the EV industry. You have a lot of investment in charging infrastructure, which is going to make it much more easy, I think, for EVs to expand their penetration in China. So the domestic market should be okay, and they're in pretty good shape relative to their international competitors as well. So I think they'll do okay at home. I think the really interesting question is, will they be able to fully take advantage of the opportunities in the international markets? And I think what you see there is two different styles of protectionism that are being unveiled. So one is the American style, where the Americans are basically saying, we don't want Chinese-made EVs in the United States in any way, shape, or form. We don't want to import them. We don't want to let Chinese companies invest in production in the United States in the same ways that the Japanese automakers invested in the US in the 80s and 90s. We don't want Chinese components in the supply chain. We just want to keep all China out. And, I think there's some debate about how successful that strategy can be. But certainly that's the intention. You have one or two other countries that are trying to have that very exclusive approach. But then if you look at most of the rest of the world, and I would include in this Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, the tendency seems to be to try and put some restrictions on imports of Chinese electric vehicles, but as a mechanism to compel the Chinese manufacturers to invest in local production, either in battery plants or in final assembly for the vehicles. So my guess would be that in most of the world, Chinese EV makers are going to do a pretty good job based on increasingly localized production. And I think a question mark in that is how much of that production truly gets localized. In other words, are they just sending kits out of China and then assembling them in Hungary or Turkey or wherever? Or are they really building full-scale component supplier networks in these new locations? And clearly, the interest of these countries would be to maximize the actual amount of local production. Now, as AJ pointed out, the supply chain for EVs is a lot less complicated than it is for conventional vehicles. So it's not exactly the same story. But I think that's the question. So basically, I think Chinese manufacturers are pretty well placed because they have very good products that are very competitively priced. And I think the big issue is, are they going to be able to navigate both the regulatory and cost challenges that come with being compelled to do a larger and larger share of their production, not in China, but in the markets that they're trying to serve.
Fantastic. So far we've been focusing on sort of the manufacturing and the policy side of things. But Ivy, I know you've been keeping a close eye on consumer trends. How are Chinese consumers actually, feeling about EVs these days, especially with all the brands competition heating up the market?
Well, just to give one stat, I think that's very telling. Last year, 60% of global EV sales took place in China. And if you are in China, I've been in China for the past 2 months, you're just on the road driving, you see a lot of green plates on the roads. And there's just that general perception of what brands really mean, what a luxury brand is. And the Mercedes and the Audis and the Porsches are kind of out of vogue. And a lot of consumers are pivoting to EV cars. Part of I think it stems from the sense of national pride that now we have these like wonderful homegrown brands with products that really ran the gamut in terms of price points. And Chinese customers are also very fickle and really hard to please. But these brands have somehow been able to captivate their attention because they are creating products that are catering to Chinese consumers. I don't think the Mercedes will ever come out with a model with karaoke in car or massage chairs, in like the BYD models. So I think there is that shifting perception for Chinese consumers that these homegrown EV brands are really delivering. And also, I think Chinese customers are also very price sensitive. So these EV cars there are value for money. You see a lot of the Didis and the rideshare cars running on the roads are EVs because it's simply cheaper to operate and to service them. So I think there is definitely that shifting perception of our homegrown brands can also deliver what a lot of foreign brands have been, and they could deliver things that we really want in terms of service. I remember when I was at the NIO In event recently, they really were trying to talk about their AI bot in car as this kind of companionship relationship. So the idea of like this emotional companionship of like your car, I think that's a selling point that we rarely hear in their Western counterparts, but it's a huge selling point, at least in the case of NIO. So I do think that consumer perception and what they feel about homegrown brands are shifting, and there is that adoption. And I don't think it's necessarily like in the US where a lot of people choose to drive EV as a statement that, I am environmentally conscious. I think for Chinese consumers, it's value for money. It's been able to operate and service these cars cheaper.
Right, fantastic. And speaking of this tension between homegrown brands and foreign brands, we can't really talk about China's EV industry without mentioning Tesla. So Kyle, I'm going to turn to you. How do you think Tesla and other foreign players has impacted China's domestic EV supply chains? And what does it mean for both Chinese and international companies moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and actually, thinking about what Ivy was just saying, and the sort of changing attitudes towards EVs in China and towards Chinese brands, car brands in China, like if you take a step back, Tesla was sort of the original brand that changed the story around EVs altogether. Right, I still remember back in the day when a good California environmentally conscious person would get a Prius, but that always assumed a sort of a trade-off between showing your green cred, but you can't accelerate from 0 to 60 in probably less than 10 seconds. But so Tesla changed the story there. Ironically now, though, and this is where I like a lot of the points that Ivy made. Ironically now, you see like this explosion of like features and designs in the Chinese EV space at a time when now Tesla itself is sort of like still chugging along with its smaller set of models. So that's sort of like one interesting connection there. But sort of more to the point of manufacturing, for example, right? So Tesla built the Shanghai Gigafactory in record time, I think in less than a year, back in 2019. And so it was like this combination of like China speed plus Tesla speed. You get this, and you had Chinese-made Teslas rolling off the production line pretty quickly, and now Tesla, the Model Y, is like one of the best-selling cars, period, in China. So what's interesting here is I wouldn't say that Tesla, started the entire EV push in China by any means, but it did, I think, help turbocharge a lot of dynamics that are already at play. So it helped to upgrade supply chains, and one example I like to give is, this sort of giant giga press where they can sort of cast an entire aluminum piece of the body or the chassis in one go, and that's actually very efficient from a manufacturing standpoint. It saves you cost, saves you labor, it saves you time. And Tesla worked with an Italian company that was actually owned by a Chinese machine making company. Long story short, those giga presses kind of proliferated, and multiple Chinese firms now make them, and they're used by many of the Chinese EV makers now. So that's sort of one example of the technology proliferating. Of course, I think even more important and perhaps harder to measure is the people, the Chinese engineers and managers who worked in the Tesla factory. I mean, if you want to understand a factory, you could go to the U.S. and try to study it there. But if you have it built in your country and you have your own engineers get trained and taught all the sort of tricks of how to do the production better, then you can take that knowledge and bring it elsewhere. And so you see that sort of knowledge transfer. It might not show up in terms of blueprints or sort of formal IP, but it's in people's heads, and that matters just as much, if not even more. So the Tesla story is a really interesting one, and of course it's part of this broader story in China of trying to figure out some way to have this like the classic win-win situation, right? Is one framing of it, where the foreign automakers they get access to this huge growing market. And they get to take advantage of Chinese production capabilities and broader Chinese supply chains that exist already. And the trade-off is then they contribute something to China's efforts to try to move up in the industry. So I think that story is one of, at least until Tesla might get beaten by its own sort of students. Until that moment really happens, it's one of a bit of interesting symbiosis.
Right, interesting indeed. And so we're going to have a whole other session on sort of the next frontier, whether it's low altitude economy or something else. But since we mentioned Tesla, AJ, let's touch on autonomous driving for a little bit. With Tesla pushing its FSD tech, how are Chinese companies reacting these days? Do you think this is something that could potentially set up a split in how autonomous vehicle technologies develops in China versus the rest of the world? Help us unpack that.
Sure, thanks, Lizzie. So I think when we talk about the different consumer preferences, I think that Ivy touched on, Chinese consumers have always been very forward-looking in terms of the tech aspect of the car. And so I think EVs are more than just electrifying transport or working on manufacturing processes. Increasingly, there is a big compute element to what the cars are offering. So these assisted driver functions are really dependent. Initially, there were sort of two ideas on how to pursue this. First was relying on a multitude of sensors and high definition mapping to enable assisted driver solutions. And that's the track that a lot of Chinese companies were following. They had the ability to produce lower costs, things like LiDAR and radar, so they could really pack these vehicles full of different sensor hardware to try and perceive the road ahead. Tesla chose a different approach. They chose high definition cameras, and more recently in their update, used a end-to-end model that basically uses AI processing images and videos of driving that allows that neural network to act accordingly. And this has really been a step change in autonomous driving. And we now see Chinese competitors more or less abandoning the sensor-centric high-definition mapping approach and sort of trying to develop their own end-to-end models. However, they reach a real bottleneck, which is having the compute power to run these solutions at the frontier. And so I think given sort of the U.S. China relationship in technology and a lot of the export controls on high-powered compute, they might not necessarily have the access in mainland China to run these types of supercomputing clusters necessary for frontier autonomous driving. Tesla's going to really struggle to straddle this. They've just been approved to run their new full self-driving in China. So it's a question of where will that data be processed and how will Tesla navigate that challenge? While at the same time, you have these Chinese companies really reorganizing their autonomous driving divisions to pursue this end-to-end strategy. For example, I know NIO recently reorganized the way that it's pursuing its autonomous driving. And so I think that once again, Tesla is acting as an accelerant in this space. I think for a long time, the sensor and mapping strategy held a lot of promise, and people were fairly bullish on Chinese competitors in this space, not least of which we've seen the proliferations of robotaxi services in places like Wuhan. But I think for getting it into individual vehicles, Tesla's new end-to-end network has really changed the game. And so we're going to really see how this develops, of course, with the geopolitical backdrop around controls on compute and things like that. So, this is a sentiment that has been voiced by many in the industry, including BYD's Wang Chuanfu, but the EV is really a mobile computing platform at the end of the day. And so as automakers try and pack more tech onto the car, it's going to, really raise some of these important questions about frontier technologies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, AJ. In the final section of our discussion, I want to turn to the broader implications and future directions of China's industrial policy, just to zoom out a little bit. So Arthur, back to you. Based on what we have seen with China's EV industry, what do you think this tells us about how China's industrial policy might play out in other sectors? Are there parts of this approach that you think other countries might be able to borrow or even learn from?
Well, I think the first question really we want to ask is how successful will industrial policy be within China, leaving aside the question of how it plays outside. But that also, I think, gives us some lessons for the rest of the world. So I think as AJ has pointed out, that there's a couple of really interesting things about the whole evolution of the EV vehicle evolution in China. So first of all, they had industrial policy for conventional vehicles and basically didn't work. And then they had industrial policy for EVs, and arguably it did work. But an important contributor to it working was the fact that Tesla came in and, as AJ said, kind of turbocharged or catalyzed certain kinds of big technological changes. And, so if you look at China's EV market prior to Tesla opening the Gigafactory, I think there was a lot of debate about, was this really success or was it just a lot of money chasing, not a very big market? And then Tesla changed the game. So I think there are a couple of lessons from this. First of all, I think to the degree that China has been successful in EVs and some of these other things, demand side as well as supply side elements are really important, and you need to make it possible for and desirable for consumers, whether they be individual consumers or business consumers, to take up this technology. And that's where I have a concern about China going forward, is that if you look at government policies right now, they are almost exclusively focused on the supply side, helping manufacturers of technology-intensive goods make more of this stuff. And they are doing a really, really bad job of trying to create and foster a dynamic demand market, a dynamic consumer market within China. And I think there's a real question about how long this is sustainable. I mean, if you have an economy where you have a lot of high-tech production, but GDP growth is sort of limping along at 3 or 4% a year, and you don't have that kind of vibrant market take up, then I think the scope for manufacturers to iterate and to test new ideas and get rewarded or punished by consumers, that scope reduces. So I think within China, we tend to focus a little bit too much on the success or alleged success of the supply side policies, and insufficiently on the conditions that were created for success by 25 years of really very pro-growth macroeconomic management. And they seem to have abandoned that second element. And I think that's potentially going to be a real challenge, not in the short term, next 2 or 3 years. But if you look in a 5 or 10 year horizon, it's hard for me to see how China can keep up its kind of innovative mojo unless you've got a somewhat stronger economy. So that's one thing.
Right.
And then I think the second thing is the importance of Tesla foreign investment. It's been very important for China. And I think if you look at other countries, and specifically the U.S., that want to promote these industries, recognizing that foreign investment and it can be an important accelerant, getting the best technology from wherever it comes is a really important component of getting this stuff right.
Fantastic. Just to continue on what Arthur just commented on, this imbalance between demand and supply. Ivy, I know you've been in the loop with industrial insiders and also policymakers. How are they thinking about this issue, this imbalance between demand and supply side support? And how are they working, or are they working to make industrial policy more coordinated, less fragmented, and potentially more accountable? What do you think we can expect from future policies that might impact this industry?
I think I want to talk a little bit more on the demand side in China. I think there is certainly demand, yet it's very expensive to service these customers' needs. I think for companies like NIO, like BYD, where they're really trying to create an ecosystem where they are able to sell you cars, they're able to sell you more services, after-sales services, including like insurance, right? One of the providers of these like an insurance technology platform that services all these EV companies, like that company has gone IPO in China. That only like shows to tell you there is a growing pie of like, even for service providers to be able to succeed. And I think that they are really trying to create this ecosystem where they could do everything within it. But the problem is that even though there is demand, there's a lot of customers, switching to EVs. It's expensive to service them, and at the same time, there's also involution. There's a lot. These companies are extremely competitive within China to try to fight for those customers who are still buying cars. So I think on the demand side, I think it's a tricky question of how they're able to service these demand, but at the same time grow the pie bigger so it is profitable for these EV companies. And on the industrial policy side, I think maybe this is not relatable to EVs, but I am hearing on the ground that a lot of, for example, some government officials are trying to create these kind of state-owned enterprises driven investment strategies to try to stop the gap on the involution where companies are competing. It's almost like a zero-sum game where they're all trying to grab that market share in a very specific area. For example, in the semiconductor industry, they're trying to fund these labs to try to help them to become more efficient, to be able to support one another. But I think that is, like Arthur was saying, I think that's not a 2 or 3 year plan. I think it will take a long time for that to come to fruition. But I think in the short term for the EV industry, I think the companies are still going to be focused very much on R&D, on innovating so that they could stay competitive amongst themselves, but also eventually have the possibility of still selling these cars to overseas market where it's not just competing with amongst themselves, that they're able to reach customers with higher purchasing power. So I think that is probably in the short run to medium term, the EV companies plan to stay in the game and to be able to succeed.
Great, fantastic. And speaking of growing the pie, finding overseas market, Kyle, I know you've done a lot of thinking on this. So let's talk about Chinese companies going global. What's your take on the global expansion efforts of Chinese EV firms and also battery firms? What are they up against, and what opportunities do you see for them out there? Is it possible to have like a green Marshall Plan, as Chinese government advisor Huang Yiping commented on, potentially in the global south?
Yeah, those are really great questions. So I think what we're watching right now is a lot of moving pieces all at the same time around the world in terms of the international trade environment, in terms of policy actions or discussions. And I think if you're sitting in the US, it might feel a little more black and white. It might feel like, should we let Chinese EVs come in or not? And if you look at the recent Biden EV tariffs, if you look at the investigation into connected vehicles, I think a lot of that is saying basically no. It is sort of like a short way of putting that. And I noticed too that leading up to all this, there's a lot of caution from the Chinese EV makers themselves in terms of investing in the U.S. market, probably already sort of pricing in this sort of response. But that's just from the U.S. If you look at the rest of the world, actually, you see quite a range of responses and ways of sort of dealing with or working with Chinese EV companies and battery makers. So, you have, for example, Thailand, which has long been a major sort of had a major auto industry, which is trying to make the pivot into EVs and is trying to use policy actually to bring in Chinese EV makers to help almost pull like a Tesla in a sense. And sort of turbocharge their own auto industry and make this shift. You have Brazil, another major auto manufacturing country that has welcomed to some extent Chinese automakers like BYD. I think it was very symbolic that some of the factories that Chinese EV makers were taking over were former like Ford factories in Brazil. So it's sort of like representative of what's happening more broadly, but. But Brazil is a more sort of in-between case where Brazil is also willing to use tariffs. So tariffs are escalating over a scheduled period. In response. And a big part of that is, of course, to try to get Chinese EV makers and battery makers to localize production within Brazil. And in that case, it can make a lot of sense, not just because of the existing manufacturing capacity and in Brazil, but also obviously the size of the market. Mexico, something similar happening there. Turkey. It has the extra advantage of being able to access the European market, and then within Europe, you have variation. You have Hungary, which is really going all in, and really trying to seal up these deals with CATL. You have Germany that also is trying to thread the needle between its existing automakers, many of whom are highly dependent on the Chinese auto market, but also seem very eager to partner with CATL and BYD and other even sort of smaller EV startups in China. So you really see quite a range. And then from the Chinese EV makers standpoint, you see a range of responses. In some cases, like in the U.S. case, they might say, okay, that's fine. We kind of expected that. In the case of the EU raising tariffs, you see some pushback. And even perhaps a differentiated strategy depending on the country, depending on the market. And then in other cases, you see sort of these not sort of like through the side door strategies, not in a nefarious way, but just in terms of like trying to still create these partnerships. For example, licensing, tech licensing for battery technology, and that even might face opposition in the U.S., which seems to be the case already. But I think the Chinese EV makers and battery makers themselves are eager to sort of work with whatever environment they have and are eager to expand and adapt to what they see as a shifting policy conditions, shifting market conditions on the ground. And we'll see going forward. I mean, none of this is going to be, just because BYD looks triumphant now and is rolling out, announcing new factories left and right in Indonesia or Mexico, perhaps potentially later, or in Turkey, it doesn't mean that it will all pan out. And so, a lot of wild cards there, including just charging infrastructure, especially in emerging markets and developing countries. So that is still a big question mark. And to what extent, kind of going back to your question about the Green Marshall Plan, to what extent might there be some strategy to build up charging infrastructure and support that internationally, not just hoping that it will be there and then the market will the Chinese EV makers can sell into that market. So there's a lot of moving parts. I mean, it's an exciting time, and I think if you look beyond the U.S., there's actually a lot more happening.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts, there are a lot of uncertainties involved, but when we talk about Chinese EV industry, we generally think of it as sort of a showcase of how industrial policy might work. But other sectors, totally different stories, say China's semiconductor industry. And that's why I wanted to turn to AJ in the final part of our discussion. If we think beyond the EV industry, how do you see China's approach might play out in other sectors like semiconductors? If China is to apply similar strategies, what are the challenges? What are the differences between those sectors? And what does that difference tell us?
Sure. So I think it's no secret that China seeks to really move up in a lot of different high-tech industries to improve their advanced manufacturing capabilities. And I think semiconductors obviously represents the pinnacle of that. I think there are some key sort of building blocks that aren't necessarily unique to EVs, but are just sort of the bedrock of solid industrial policy and economic strategy. So for example, the clustering of supply chains, having adjacent supplier density in these geographic clusters is something that worked really well in the EV industry. You see the rise of a municipality like Hefei integrating really holistic supply chains to succeed in the EV industry. And so I think that is sort of a lesson that can obviously be applied to areas like semiconductors to try and get the entire supply chain, upstream materials providers, fabricators, and downstream companies, sort of getting them together and having that supplier density is something that could definitely help China's push in semiconductors. However, there is sort of a cautionary flip side to this, which is you want to try and rein in the irrational exuberance that I think we saw throughout the electric vehicle push, where every local government is racing to create their own champion and a lot of excess waste in poor low quality projects along the way. And so I think the Chinese government and policymakers are keenly aware of trying to make the industrial policy less fragmented at the local level. So while local governments are often still the implementers, I would often say you don't need an advanced semiconductor fab in every province in China, for example, or in every municipality. And so it's a question of trying to calibrate the right level of competition, that same hyper competition that produced sort of the champions we see in EVs, and trying to calibrate that in other areas like semiconductors where the stakes are frankly higher, right? The CapEx is higher. We don't want to see, I think, Chinese industrial policy and semiconductors go the route of companies like HSMC, for example, which was a case where a fraudster in Wuhan posed as a former TSMC executive and I think got more than $1 billion from the Wuhan government. And so I think, the EV industry has its fair share of these busted projects. I think much of that is baked in to the industrial policy calculus, but it really is, I think, a real initiative on the part of policymakers to try and rein in that irrational exuberance and make the policy more coherent at the national level to sort of avoid those redundancies where possible.
Fantastic. And that concludes our discussion for today. A big thank you to all our panelists for such an engaging discussion, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Just a reminder, this is the first of many conversations in this series, so please keep an eye out for upcoming sessions as we continue to break down China's evolving economic strategies and their global impact. Have a great day, everyone.